They say the most dangerous woman in Seoul wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a smile and a hunger that her husband was too busy to feed. Shantel Davis had a husband who commanded fear from every corner of South Korea's underworld, yet couldn't find 5 minutes to look her in the eyes. She had wealth without warmth, luxury without love, a name that opened every door in Seoul, but inside her own home, she was invisible. Choi Jun built an empire. He just forgot that empires need tending. And so did marriages. He sent his most loyal soldier to fill the silence he left behind. What he didn't account for was that loyalty has limits, and a woman who has been starved long enough will feast when the table is finally set. One neglected wife, one conflicted lieutenant, one empire built on trust, about to learn what betrayal truly costs. Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Stories. On today's episode, I'm bringing you love, power, romance, loyalty, betrayal, neglect, and the consequences of thirst. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe, seat back, and allow me draw you into my world of tales. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. Now, let's get back to this amazing story. Shantel Davis didn't grow up dreaming of Seoul. She grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a house where her mother played Anita Baker on Sunday mornings and told her daughters, "Never let a man make you small, no matter how big he is." Shantel remembered those words. She just didn't know how soon she'd need them. She was 27 when she met Choi Jun at a private art exhibition in Dubai. He was standing alone near a painting that Mafia lords bid houses and fortunes over. Holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, wearing a suit that whispered money so quietly it was almost rude. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. Their eyes met once. He looked away first, not out of shyness, but the way powerful men do when they've already decided something. Like looking too long would give too much away. By the end of the night, he had her number. 3 months later, he had her heart. 6 months after that, she had his name. And the world called it a fairy tale. Choi Jun was the kind of man who showed up completely, until he didn't. In the beginning, he was present, attentive even. He would clear his schedule for dinner. He remembered she hated coriander. He once flew her to Jeju Island for a weekend because she'd mentioned in passing that she'd never seen the ocean from a cliffside. That version of Choi Jun made her believe she hadn't made a mistake. But empires don't run on romance. And slowly, steadily, the calls during dinner turned into him leaving the table entirely. The weekend trips became promises. The promises became silence. Shantel would sit in their penthouse overlooking the Han River, floor-to-ceiling windows, soft lighting, every luxury a woman could want, and feel like she was disappearing. She tried. She dressed up for dinners he canceled. She planned surprises he came home too late to enjoy. She once waited up until 3 a.m. in lingerie and fell asleep on the couch alone. That was the night something inside her quietly gave up waiting. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't throw plates or scream. She was too proud for that. She simply recalibrated, rebuilt her walls, smiled at the right events, wore the right clothes, played the role of Choi Jun's wife with the kind of grace that made people in Seoul society whisper about how lucky he was. He never noticed the shift. That was the problem. The first time Jae Kim knocked on her door, it was a Tuesday. Choi Jun had promised to take her to a gallery opening she'd been looking forward to for weeks. A Nigerian-Korean fusion art showcase in Itaewon, the kind of event that felt like it was made for someone like Shantel. Cultural. Electric. Alive. He canceled at 4 p.m. via a text message. Something came up. Jun. Not even an apology. Just his name. Like a signature on a business memo. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. She opened it still in her robe, expecting the housekeeper. It was Jae Kim. He stood there in a dark jacket, hands relaxed at his sides, with the kind of stillness that told you this man had been in rooms far more tense than this one. He was younger than Jun by maybe 5 years, lean, sharp-jawed, with eyes that held something careful behind them. Observant. Like he was always reading the room before he spoke. "Mrs. Choi," he said. Mr. Jun asked me to escort you to the exhibition tonight, and to apologize on his behalf. Shantel stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that comes from a place that stopped finding things funny a long time ago. He sent you, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Jae Kim, this quiet, composed man standing at her door holding an apology that wasn't even his to give, and made a decision. Give me 20 minutes, she said, and closed the door. She went to that exhibition. Jae Kim drove. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk, which she appreciated more than he knew. When they arrived, he walked 2 steps behind her like a shadow that knew its place. But at one point, she stopped in front of a painting, a woman rendered in deep ochres and blues, face turned away, posture carrying the specific weight of someone who had chosen dignity over despair, and she said without turning around, "What do you see when you look at that?" There was a pause. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Jae Kim said quietly, "Someone who decided the world didn't deserve her tears." Shantel turned and looked at him then. Really looked. And Jae Kim, to his credit, held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking back at the painting. But those 2 seconds said everything. Shantel didn't sleep well that night. Not because anything happened. Nothing did. Jae Kim drove her home, walked her to the elevator, said goodnight with the same quiet professionalism he'd carried all evening, and left. That was the problem. She lay in the dark of a bed too large for one person, staring at the ceiling, replaying those 2 seconds. The way his eyes didn't flinch. The way his answer came from somewhere real, not rehearsed, not performative. Just honest. Someone who decided the world didn't deserve her tears. She told herself it was nothing. He was doing his job. She was starved for attention and projecting onto the nearest warm presence. She was a grown woman, a married woman, and she knew exactly what loneliness could do to a person's perception. She told herself all of that. And then Choi Jun came home at 2 a.m., smelling like cigarettes and cold air, slipped into bed without a word, and was asleep in 4 minutes. Shantel lay there listening to him breathe and thought, when did we become strangers sharing a bed? She didn't have an answer. But somewhere in the dark, a door she hadn't noticed before had cracked open just slightly. Just slightly. The errand started small. June sent Jae to collect a package she needed signed for. Then to accompany her to a charity luncheon when June's schedule conflicted, which it always did. Then to handle a situation with a vendor for her interior design consultancy, a small business she'd built quietly on the side because she needed something that was entirely hers. Jae handled it efficiently, professionally. He never overstepped, never lingered longer than necessary. Always 2 steps behind. Always Mrs. Choi. But Shantel was paying attention. She noticed he took his coffee black with no sugar. She noticed he held doors open not out of performance but out of instinct. She noticed the way he listened, completely, without interrupting, without already formulating his response while she was still talking. The way Choi Jun used to listen. Before the empire swallowed him whole. She noticed that Jae Kim laughed rarely, but when he did, it completely rearranged his face. She filed all of it away and told herself she was simply observant by nature. She was lying to herself. And somewhere underneath the composure and the careful walls, she knew it. 6 weeks in, they were having lunch. It had started innocently enough. She'd asked him to wait while she finished a call, offered him something to eat because it was past noon, and somewhere between her finishing the call and him saying, "You really don't have to," they were sitting across from each other at her kitchen island with food between them like it was the most natural thing in the world. They talked for 2 hours. She learned that Jae Kim was from Busan originally, that he'd met Choi Jun's father before Jun himself, had been brought into the organization at 19 by the elder Choi, who'd seen something in him worth cultivating, that he'd stayed out of loyalty to a man who is now gone, and a sense of duty to the empire that man built. "And Jun?" she asked carefully. "Do you stay for him too?" Jae picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. "Jun is my brother," he said. "You don't leave family." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. Because she heard what lived underneath it. The complexity, the obligation, the love that wasn't simple but was real. This man had more depth than she'd been given credit for. And depth, to a woman drowning in a shallow marriage, was dangerous. She smiled at him. Soft. Deliberate. Jun is lucky to have you, she said. Jay looked at her for a moment. That careful, reading the room look, and then he nodded slowly and looked away. He knew. He absolutely knew what that smile meant. And the fact that he looked away told her two things simultaneously. One, he wasn't unaffected. And two, he was going to fight it. Good, she thought. She liked a challenge. Now this is where the story gets complicated, and I need you to be honest with me in the comments. Because Shantel wasn't an evil woman. She wasn't calculating in a cold way. She was lonely in the way that hollows a person out slowly, quietly, until they'll reach for almost anything that feels like warmth. But she was also deliberate. And that changes things. Was she wrong for what she was about to do? Or was Choi Jun wrong first? The shift happened on a rainy Thursday in October. Her consultancy had hit a wall. A supplier had pulled out last minute on a major project, and she'd spent the entire morning on the phone getting nowhere. By afternoon, she was sitting on her living room floor surrounded by fabric samples and contracts, hair pulled back, completely undone in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Jay came by to drop off documents Jun had sent. He knocked. She buzzed him in without thinking. He walked in and stopped when he saw her, not with judgment, not with discomfort, just with the quiet recognition of someone seeing another person clearly for the first time without the costume on. He set the documents on the table. Then, without a word, he sat down on the floor across from her, looked at the contracts spread between them, and said, "Walk me through it." She stared at him. "I'm not your assistant," he said simply, "but I have time, and you clearly need to think out loud." Shantel Davis, who had not cried in front of another human being in over a year, felt her throat close. She didn't cry. She was too proud for that. But she talked. For an hour she talked, and Jae Kim sat on her floor and listened like she was the most important thing happening in the world. He asked two questions, both sharp, both useful. By the time they were done, she had a solution. She looked at him across the scattered contracts and fabric samples and the gray Seoul rain sliding down the floor to ceiling windows, and something moved in her chest that she had no business feeling. Jay stood up, straightened his jacket. "You'll be fine," he said quietly. "You're sharper than you give yourself credit for." He left before she could respond. And Shantel sat there in the silence he left behind, warm, buzzing, terrified, and realized she was in serious trouble. Not because she was falling, but because she had already fallen and hadn't even noticed the ground disappear beneath her. Tell me something. Has anyone ever shown up for you in a quiet moment when the one person who was supposed to be there simply wasn't? Drop it in the comments. Let us know what happened, what you did, and what you'd do if you were in Shantel's shoes. Because what Shantel felt on that floor, that's not fiction. That's human. Let's find out if she stops fighting it entirely. Shantel gave herself 1 week. 1 week to get it together. To remember who she was, who she had married, and what was at stake. She was Choi Jun's wife. She lived in a world where loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival requirement. She had seen enough of her husband's world to know that lines existed for a reason. She avoided Jay for 7 days. Declined the errands. Told Jun she'd handle things herself. Kept her distance with the discipline of a woman who understood exactly what fire felt like and had no intention of getting burned. On the 8th day, Jun sent Jay to accompany her to a business dinner she couldn't get out of. A formal affair in Gangnam, the kind where wives existed to look beautiful and say little. She wore red. She told herself it wasn't intentional. She was lying again. Jay was waiting at the car when she came down. He turned when he heard the elevator open, and for the first time since she'd known him, his composure cracked. Just slightly. Just for a second. His eyes moved over her once, and then he looked away, jaw tight, and opened the car door without a word. Shantel smiled to herself and got in. The dinner was everything she expected. Powerful men talking about money in careful language, while their wives performed contentment. She played her role flawlessly. Warm smile, measured words, graceful exits from conversations that bored her. From across the room, she could feel Jay's eyes tracking her the way security men do. Professional. Watchful. But at one point their eyes met across the crowded room, and it wasn't professional anymore. It lasted 3 seconds. She counted. In the car, on the way home, the silence was different. Thicker. The city moved past the windows in streaks of neon, and she could feel the awareness between them like a physical thing, present, undeniable, and running out of places to hide. "You don't enjoy those events," Jay said. Not a question. "Does it show?" she asked. Only to someone paying attention. She turned to look at his profile in the dark. The city light caught the line of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands on the wheel. "And are you," she asked softly, "paying attention?" The muscle in his jaw moved. His eyes stayed on the road. "Mrs. Choi." "Shantel," she corrected. "Call me Shantel." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. He didn't say her name that night. But he didn't say Mrs. Choi again either. And in the language of two people trying very hard not to want each other, that middle ground was everything. This is where I need to pause and be honest with you. Because what Shantel did next, some of you will understand completely. And some of you will judge her. But before you decide, remember that this woman had spent months being invisible inside her own marriage. Remember that the man who was supposed to see her had stopped looking. Loneliness doesn't excuse every choice. But it explains more than we're comfortable admitting. She started creating reasons. Small ones at first. A question about a vendor that she could have Googled. A security concern at her consultancy that required his opinion. A dinner she needed company for because Jun, predictably, had canceled. Jay showed up every time. Because that was his job. Because Jun trusted him completely. Because the empire ran on that trust like blood through a body. And every time Jay showed up, Shantel chipped away at his composure with the patience of a woman who had decided what she wanted. She learned his coffee order, and had it ready when he arrived. She asked about Busan, remembered details from their first conversation, and referenced them weeks later. She laughed at things he said, and held the laughter a beat too long. She found excuses to stand close. To let silences breathe between them rather than filling them. She was fluent in the language of slow seduction, and she used every word. Jae Kim was not a naive man. He had navigated the most dangerous rooms in South Korea's underworld without flinching. He could read threats before they materialized. He had survived by being several steps ahead of every situation. But he had no defense for this. Because Shantel wasn't threatening him. She was simply present. Warm and real, and paying him the kind of attention that made a man feel like the only solid thing in a room. And that, for a man who spent his entire existence in service of someone else's empire, was more disarming than any weapon. He started arriving earlier than necessary. He started finding his own reasons. One evening they ended up on her penthouse terrace. The Han River spread out beneath them like a dark mirror reflecting Seoul's skyline. They were standing close, closer than professional distance allowed, with drinks in hand and a conversation that had drifted far from anything work-related. She turned to him mid-sentence, and he was already looking at her. Not the careful, guarded look from before. Something rawer than that. Something that had slipped past every wall he'd built, and was standing there exposed, and almost angry about it. "Jay," she said quietly. "Don't," he said. His voice was low, controlled. But underneath it, she heard something straining against the control. "Don't what?" "Say whatever you're about to say." She set her glass down on the terrace railing, turned to face him fully. "What am I about to say?" she asked. Jay looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw the entire war. Loyalty against longing. Duty against desire. Every reason this was wrong stacked against one single devastating reason that made all of them feel irrelevant. He looked away first. Pressed his hand against the railing. "He's my brother," he said. Quiet. Almost to himself. "I know," she said. "This can't happen." "I know," she said again. And then she reached up and touched his jaw. Gently. The way you touch something you've wanted for so long, the wanting has become its own kind of pain. Jay closed his eyes. And that was the moment. Not a kiss. Not words. Just that, his eyes closing under her touch like a man who had finally run out of fight. She had him. Except, and this is what Shantel didn't fully understand yet, having Jay Kim was never going to be simple. Because unlike the hunger she felt, his conflict didn't disappear the moment he stopped resisting.
It went underground.
Quiet. Festering. He was not a man who did things lightly. And what happened between them on that terrace, what continued to happen in the weeks that followed in stolen hours and careful silence, sat on his conscience like a stone he couldn't put down. She felt his guilt and mistook it for depth. She felt his restraint and called it intensity. She was so intoxicated by finally having what she'd been starving for that she didn't see what was happening to him. Jay Kim was unraveling. Not loudly. Men like Jay don't unravel loudly. But in the meetings with Jun, in the way he held himself slightly apart, in the extra drink he poured at the end of long nights, something was shifting in the man who had never once in his life betrayed the people he loved. And Choi Jun, consumed, distracted, ruling his empire from boardrooms and back rooms, hadn't noticed yet. Because here is what nobody tells you about powerful men. They may stop looking at what's right in front of them, but they never fully stop seeing. It lives in the peripheral. Patient. Waiting. And Choi Jun was starting to feel something he couldn't name. A temperature change. A frequency slightly off. The way Shantel sat at dinner, present in body, but somewhere else entirely. The way Jay reported in each morning, precise as always, but with an energy that had shifted in a way Jun's instincts were beginning to register. He hadn't said anything yet. But the man who had built an empire on reading people before they knew they were being read was beginning to read his two most trusted people. And what he was finding he didn't like. Before we go on, I need your take on this. Did Jay ever really have a choice? Or was Shantel always going to win? Do you think he could have resisted and shut her down, or did she have him wrapped around her fingers from the very beginning? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's find out if Choi Jun's eyes finally open, and trust me when I tell you, nothing prepares you for what a quiet man does when he finally decides to speak. Let's dive back. Choi Jun was not a man who asked questions he didn't already know the answer to. That was something his father had taught him early. Never ask a question in a room, the elder Choi used to say, unless you're prepared for the answer to change everything. Jun had lived by that principle for 15 years. In boardrooms. In back rooms. In negotiations where the wrong question could end lives. He had built an empire on patience and precision, on watching, waiting, and moving only when the moment was undeniable. So when he started noticing, he didn't say a word. He watched. It started with Shantel's phone. Not that he went through it. He didn't need to. It was the way she angled it slightly away when she was typing. Small. Subtle. The kind of adjustment a person makes unconsciously when they've developed a habit of privacy they didn't have before. Then it was the energy in the room when Jay reported in for morning briefings. Jun sat at the head of his office table the way he always did, still, composed, commanding, and he watched Jay the way a man watches a card player who's learned to control his tells but hasn't quite caught them all. Jay was good. He was always good. Eye contact steady. Reports precise. Posture exactly where it should be. But there was something underneath it now. A weight that hadn't been there before. The specific gravity of a man carrying something he hadn't been given permission to put down. Jun recognized it because he had worn it himself once. A long time ago. Before the Empire made him into something that didn't bend under weight anymore. He said nothing. He moved one piece on the board instead. He came home for dinner. Not just once. 3 nights in a row. Unannounced. He sat across from Shantel at the table he had abandoned for months, and he watched her recalibrate in real time. The micro-adjustment in her eyes, the carefully constructed warmth she assembled quickly enough that most people wouldn't catch the delay. Jun caught it. He reached across the table on the second night and held her hand. She let him. Smiled at him. Said something warm about the food. And Jun looked at his wife. This breathtaking, composed, lonely woman he had stopped seeing somewhere between building the fourth quarter and expanding into Incheon, and felt something move in his chest that he had no language for. Not love rekindled. Not quite. Grief. For something still technically alive but already gone. He had done this. He knew that. He was not a man who rewrote his own failures as someone else's story. The neglect was his. The empty dinners were his. The canceled plans and one-word text messages and 2 a.m. arrivals, all his. But knowing you built the fire doesn't make it hurt less when you watch it burn. He poured more wine, changed the subject, smiled at something she said. And inside, behind everything Choi Jun showed the world, a cold, slow fury was beginning to arrange itself. Not at Shantel. Not yet. At Jay. Because a man can understand a hungry woman reaching for warmth. That is human. That is what neglect produces. Jun was honest enough with himself to hold that truth. But a lieutenant, a brother, a man who had eaten at his table, stood beside him at his father's funeral, who knew the full weight of what loyalty meant in their world. That was a different conversation entirely. Now, before we go further, I want you to think about something and answer in the comments. Because this story is about to split into two directions emotionally, and I need to know where you stand. Is Choi Jun a villain in this story, or a man who simply loved his empire more than his wife until it was too late? Tell me, because your answer says more about you than it does about him. The confirmation came on a Wednesday. Jun had told Jae he would be in Incheon until Thursday morning. A meeting with port officials that required his presence overnight. Routine, documented, the kind of thing that happened monthly. He came back Wednesday night instead. Not because he suspected. He told himself that. A meeting had ended early. Weather was favorable. There was no dramatic decision to test anyone. He simply came home ahead of schedule. He let himself into the penthouse quietly. The lights in the main living area were low. He could hear music, something soft, jazz maybe, coming from the direction of the terrace. He set his bag down in the entrance corridor, walked toward the sound, and stopped. Shantel and Jae were on the terrace. They weren't doing anything incriminating in that precise moment. They were sitting across from each other at the small terrace table with drinks between them and the Seoul skyline behind them. But it was the way they were sitting. The ease of it. The comfort. The way Shantel was leaning forward with her chin in her hand, looking at Jae like he was saying the most interesting things she'd heard in years. The way Jae was talking, relaxed in a way Jun had never seen him. Like a man at home in a space that wasn't his. Like a man who had been here before. Many times. Jun stood in the doorway to the terrace for what felt like a very long time. Neither of them saw him. He watched his wife laugh at something Jae said. Real laughter. Unguarded. The kind she used to aim at him in Dubai when they were new and the world was still full of possibility. And something inside Choi Jun went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes. He stepped back from the doorway, walked back to the entrance, picked up his bag, and left. He drove for 2 hours without a destination. Through the Han River Bridge, past Itaewon, into the quieter edges of the city, where no one knew his face and the empire felt very far away. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set and that cold, quiet fury sitting in the passenger seat beside him. He did not call anyone, did not make a single move. Because Choi Jun understood something that most men in his position forget. Reaction is for weak men. Response is for powerful ones. He needed to think. He needed to decide what kind of man he was going to be at the end of the story. And in the meantime, life in the penthouse continued as though nothing had shifted. Shantel texted him that evening to ask when he'd be home from Incheon. He replied, "Tomorrow afternoon. Sleep well." She sent a heart emoji. He stared at it for a long time. Jae submitted his morning report the next day without knowing his brother had already seen enough. Clean. Professional. Precise as always. Jun read it. Responded normally. Gave him 3 new assignments. And activated something he had never once used against anyone inside his own organization. He put surveillance on both of them. Not aggressively. Quietly. the way Jun did everything. Two trusted men, not from Jae's half of the organization, carefully chosen, with one simple instruction. Watch. Document. Tell me nothing I don't ask for. He was building a file. Not for revenge. For clarity. Because when Choi Jun moved, and he would move, he was not going to be wrong about a single detail. He was not going to be the husband who exploded on feeling alone. He was going to be certain. Precise. Devastating. He was going to know everything. And then he was going to decide. What Shantel didn't know, what Jae didn't know, was that the empire they had been conducting their secret inside was now watching them. Every meeting, every errand, every stolen hour, and careful silence. Choi Jun had stopped being the distracted husband. He had become something far more dangerous. He had become patient. And patience, in the hands of a man who had used it to build an empire, was the most terrifying thing in the world. The question is no longer whether Choi Jun knows. He knows. The question is, what does a man like that do with what he knows? And more importantly, what happens to an empire when the two people holding it up from opposite sides both start to fall? Drop a fire in the comments if you're still with me. Let's see if everything breaks. There is a specific kind of silence that lives in a room just before everything falls apart. Not peaceful silence. Not comfortable silence. The kind that has weight to it, texture, the kind that presses against your skin and tells you something ancient and instinctive that your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Shantel felt it on a Monday morning and couldn't explain why. She was sitting at her vanity getting ready for a consultancy meeting when it settled over her like a temperature drop. Nothing had happened. June had left early, as usual. Jae was scheduled to pick her up at 10. Everything was exactly where it always was. But something felt off. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. The diamonds at her ears. The silk robe. The penthouse reflected behind her like a stage set for a life she had stopped fully inhabiting. She thought about Jae, and warmth moved through her chest immediately, that involuntary response that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. She thought about the way he'd looked at her last Thursday on the terrace. The way he'd said her name, Shantel, finally, after all this time, like he'd been holding it in his mouth carefully and had finally allowed himself to say it out loud. She smiled at her reflection. She didn't notice that her husband had used her full name in every conversation for the past 2 weeks instead of the shortened version he'd called her since Dubai. Small things. She had stopped paying attention to small things. That was her first mistake. Jae arrived at 10 exactly. She came down in a cream coat and heels, and he was leaning against the car in that particular way he had, relaxed but alert, always both simultaneously, and when he saw her something moved briefly across his face before he composed it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. They drove. The city moved around them. She reached across and touched the back of his hand lightly, just for a second, just because she could, just because the wanting had become so familiar it no longer felt dangerous. Jae turned his hand over briefly and held her fingers. Then let go. Put both hands back on the wheel. She watched his profile and thought, he's still fighting it. Even now. Even after everything. And she loved that about him and was frustrated by it in equal measure. The guilt never fully left his eyes, and she had learned to read its degrees, heavy on certain days, quieter on others, but always present. She had told herself it would fade eventually, that given enough time and enough of her, the guilt would lose the argument. She was wrong about that too. Her meeting ran long. Jae waited in the car. When she came back out 2 hours later, he was on a call that he ended quickly when he saw her. Too quickly, and the careful look returned to his face. "Everything okay?" she asked as she got in. "June wants us back," he said. "He's called a full organization meeting. Everyone." Shantel stilled. Full organization meetings happened 3 times a year. Scheduled. Formal. Announced weeks in advance. This one had been called this morning. For this afternoon. She looked at Jae's profile. Something in the set of his jaw made the silence from earlier return, heavier now, pressing harder. "Did he say why?" she asked carefully. Jae didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Jae." "He didn't say," Jae replied. Quiet. Controlled. But underneath it she heard something she had never heard from this man before.
Fear.
Not the obvious kind. The sophisticated kind, the kind that lives in a man who has just realized that the thing he feared most has already happened, and the only question remaining is the shape of the consequence. Shantel turned and looked out the window. Her heart was beating very fast. The organization meeting was held at Jun's main facility in Mapo, a building that looked unremarkable from the outside and contained multitudes within. Shantel had been here twice before for formal occasions. She walked in beside Jay and felt immediately the temperature of the room. 40 men. Senior lieutenants, regional heads, trusted associates, the architecture of the Haneul Syndicate assembled in one space. They were talking in clusters, but the energy was taut, uncertain. The specific atmosphere of people who had been summoned without explanation by a man who did not summon without reason. Choi Jun stood at the front of the room. He was wearing a dark suit.
No tie.
Arms at his sides. And he was, as he always was in his most dangerous moments, completely, terrifyingly calm. His eyes found Shantel when she walked in. He smiled at her. It didn't reach his eyes. She took her seat to the side. Jay moved to his position at Jun's right. And Choi Jun looked out at his organization with the expression of a man who had spent 2 weeks deciding exactly what kind of man he was going to be and had arrived at his answer. He spoke for 12 minutes. About the empire. About its foundation. About the principles the elder Choi had built it on, and the principles Jun had expanded it under. He spoke about loyalty, what it meant in their world, what it cost, what it required. He spoke about it the way a man speaks about something he has loved deeply and watched be desecrated. The room was absolutely silent. And then he said, without raising his voice, without a single crack in his composure, every empire has a moment that tests whether it deserves to survive. We have arrived at ours. He looked at Jay. Jay held his gaze. Jaw set. Eyes steady. He did not look away, because Jae Kim was not built for the pretense of innocence. He had known this moment was coming. He had felt it approaching for days like weather. The room felt it too. Heads turned. The understanding moved through the assembled men like electricity. Jun spoke directly to Jae then. Still calm. Still measured. He didn't detail the betrayal publicly. That was not how Choi Jun operated. He was too precise for spectacle. Too proud for public grief. He simply said, the man I trusted above all others has shown me the limits of trust. And I have decided what that means for this organization.
He paused.
Jae Kim is released from his position. Effective today. With full severance and safe passage. No retaliation from anyone within this organization. This is my directive, and it is absolute. He built half of what stands in this room, and that is not nothing. But he cannot stay. The silence that followed was seismic. 40 men who had operated under the assumption that Jae Kim was immovable, that he was as foundational to the Haneul Syndicate as the elder Choi's name, sat with that reality rearranged in real time. Jae stood very still. Then he nodded once.
Slowly.
The nod of a man accepting a verdict he had written himself. He looked at Jun for a long moment, and in that look lived 15 years. The elder Choi's funeral. The wars they'd survived together. The debts paid and the loyalty given and the brotherhood that had been real, genuinely real, before Chantel's terrace and red dresses and 2 seconds of eye contact that started a fire neither of them knew how to stop. I'm sorry, Jae said. Quiet enough that only the front of the room heard it. Jun looked at him for 3 seconds. Then looked away. And that was the end of 15 years. What happened next, nobody in that room expected. Because they expected Jun to turn to Shantel last. Expected the public moment. The dramatic confrontation. The powerful man addressing his errant wife in front of his entire organization. Instead, he walked to where she was sitting. Stood before her. And spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You were the one thing in my life that wasn't the empire, he said. And I treated you like you were. Shantel looked up at him. Her throat was tight. Her eyes bright. Jun. I know what I did, he said. I know what I didn't do. I'm not standing here pretending otherwise. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table in front of her. Everything you're entitled to is in there. The consultancy is yours fully. I've already transferred it. The accounts are handled. You will not want for anything. She stared at the envelope, then at him. I don't want the money, she whispered. June, please. I know, he said simply, but it's what I have to give. He straightened, looked at her one final time, and in his eyes she saw it. Not rage, not coldness, something far worse.
Sorrow.
And the specific exhaustion of a man who had already grieved something before it was officially over. He walked back to the front of the room, addressed his organization. The meeting continued, and Shantel sat with that envelope in front of her and understood, fully, finally, devastatingly, what she had done. She had wanted to be seen, had wanted warmth and presence, and a man who showed up. Those desires were real and valid and human. But she had reached for those things by burning down what she had. And fire, once it's done, doesn't rebuild what it consumed. Jay was gone within the week. Back to Busan, the word came quietly through channels. No drama, no retaliation. June had meant what he said, safe passage, absolute. Even in his betrayal, Jae Kim was released with dignity because Choi Jun was not a man who rewrote history to make his pain easier. Jae had been loyal for 15 years. That 15 years was real. The ending didn't erase it. The organization split, not violently but structurally. 11 of Jae's men requested release within the month. June granted everyone, quietly, without punishment, because holding men by force was not how his father built the empire, and it was not how he intended to maintain it. The Haneul Syndicate survived.
Smaller.
Reconfigured. But standing. Shantel moved out of the penthouse on a Thursday morning, the same day of the week Jae had first knocked on her door with an apology that wasn't his to give. She stood in the entrance corridor of the home she had spent 2 years feeling invisible in and looked at it one final time. The floor-to-ceiling windows. The Han River beyond them. The dinner table set perfectly for a meal that would never happen. She picked up her bag and left. She had her consultancy. Her freedom, her name. She kept Davis, let go of Choi without being asked. She rebuilt in the way strong women do, quietly, stubbornly, without audience. But there were nights, Seoul lit up outside her smaller, simpler apartment window, when she thought about a terrace and jazz music and a man who sat on her floor surrounded by fabric samples and looked at her like she was worth understanding. She thought about what he said. Someone who decided the world didn't deserve her tears. She wondered if he thought about that painting. If he was in Busan watching the ocean. If the guilt had finally quieted, or if it still sat on him like a stone. She never found out. Because some doors, once closed by the right hands, stay closed. And Choi Jun? He returned to his empire. Rebuilt its structure. Became, if anything, more formidable. More precise. The kind of man that loss either destroys or sharpens. It sharpened him. But those who had known him longest, the ones who remembered the version of him that flew a woman to Jeju Island because she'd never seen the ocean from a cliffside, said something had gone quiet in him that used to hum. Not broken. Just absent. Like a room where music used to play. He had built an empire. Lost a wife. Released a brother. And was left, as powerful men so often are, completely, magnificently alone. And that is what the consequences of neglect look like. Not always explosions. Sometimes just silence. Envelopes on tables. Nods that carry 15 years. Women leaving on Thursday mornings with their maiden names reclaimed. Nobody won this story. But everybody chose it. Shantel chose hunger over patience. Jae chose feeling over loyalty. And Choi Jun, he made his choice long before any of this started. He chose the empire every single time she needed him to choose her. The question I want to leave you with, and I need you to answer this honestly in the comments. Who do you hold most responsible for how this ended? Is it Shantel, for pursuing what she wanted regardless of the cost? Is it Jae for knowing better and crossing the line anyway? Or is it Choi Jun for building a golden cage and calling it a marriage? Tell me below. If this story moved you, if you felt something, hit that like button right now because it genuinely helps this channel bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are just getting started in this world of Afro-Korean forbidden love and power dynamics. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about what neglect really costs. I am so grateful you stayed until the end. This has been Afro-Korean Love Stories. Until next time, choose people over empires. Before it's too late.